Unfiltered, uncensored, unprecedented TV. We are indeed unfiltered, uncensored, and unprecedented here at Unprecedented TV. And you don't get more censored than my very special guest today, the one and only David Shayler. I'm pleased to say, honored indeed, that we are one of the very few platforms that is willing to give David a microphone these days. So controversial is he. But to judge for yourself about what David's got to say, not just about the big issues of the day, but also how we got into the terrible mess that we're in on this planet. Two, in particular, major events from earlier this century, one of which, the dreaded anniversary, is coming round again, 24 years since that dreadful day on September the 11th, 2001, when the world changed. I described it earlier in the week as a timeline genocide. In other words, all sorts of potential futures were eliminated at that point, just at a time when we thought the world was turning away from war and for the better, towards a peaceful future for all of us, dare I say it, even some degree of emancipation and enlightenment. Instead, of course, we've had nothing but fear-mongering, enmity and war, with elites seemingly determined to divide us as people as much as possible. We had the entirely illegal invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, causing not only untold death and destruction for the people of those countries, but also, of course, the backflow of migrants to Western Europe, something keenly felt now here in Britain, particularly after the judgment by the High Court that the hotel in Epping, the Bell Hotel, has to be closed and cannot simply house thousands of migrants. I believe the number is up 14% since this Labour government came to power. Of course, there are a lot of people who simply hate Muslims in Britain. There's no point trying to hide the fact. They hate all immigrants. They hate Muslims. They hate the ones that came here legally as well as illegally. Frankly, they hate Hindus, but Hindus tend to be less visible than Muslims. I was going to get into dangerous water there. See what nearly happened. I was going to say Hindus do tend to integrate better. And then, of course, Britain has an ever-growing Black African and West Indian descent population, such that by 2065, I think, white British people will be in a minority, something we would have thought unthinkable when I was a child. But leaving the demographics aside for the moment, this hatred of Muslims, which looks sadly as if it's turning increasingly violent, spills over to hatred of Palestinians because they're Muslims. And this has been particularly cultivated by Zionist agents in the UK who say, look, we're besieged by these horrible Muslims, so are you, seemingly omitting the fact that the Muslims are native to Palestine, and perhaps if they left them alone, then they wouldn't want to flood westward either. So, oh, what a mess it is. What a horrible, horrible mess. And joining me today, as I say, to help guide me through it is the one and only David Shayler. Welcome to the program, David.
Hi, Basil. Thank you very much for having me on.
My pleasure. Now, before we get into the high weeds, a few of the sort of slightly lower weeds, we're just going to have a look at a few memes here for our entertainment, and I invite you to comment. Here we are, the arrest counter. There we go. Number of Epstein clients arrested, 0. Democrats who committed treason, 0. Jan 6 committee, 0. NGO money laundering, 2020 stolen electricity, 0. Man throwing a sandwich is a felony. That's obviously for our American viewers.
We might add to that as well. We could add to that, Basil, people arrested for war crimes.
Yes.
Given we now know that Afghanistan, Iraq, actions in Libya and Syria constitute war crimes. We haven't seen anybody arrested in connection for supporting the obvious war crimes currently going on in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine.
You make a very good point. There were moves to
but bearing in mind, of course,
I was going to say there were moves to arrest Tony Blair going back a few years, weren't there, for his part in the Iraq debacle, but all that sort of went away. And now, of course, he's rich as Croesus, and the spookily named Tony Blair Institute for Global Change have been behind the post-Holocaust planning for Gaza. I think they're in league with various factions seeking to turn it into some kind of Riviera-type resort. David.
Yes, well, the problem with prosecuting Blair under war crimes legislation was that they, as usual with these things, because both sides of the legal system are working with each other, it's not a system of law. And what they did was try to prosecute Blair under the International Criminal Court Act. But that doesn't apparently make an the war crime of invasion principles for David written down. It's a principle of law down. Now, that doesn't have to be an act of parliament, of course. That can be written down anywhere. And war crimes are very specifically defined within the principles of Nuremberg. And of course, Blair waged war in Afghanistan, as we now know, because there was no case against Afghanistan in terms of 9/11, that 9/11 was carried out by Israel, which is something I'm sure we can talk about in a bit, but also the fact there were no WMDs in Iraq either. So Blair committed fraud, was involved in waging war, and should face the usual punishment for waging war, which is hanging, basically. Now, in the past, I didn't believe in the death penalty, but in recent years, I've come to believe that if that death penalty had been there, we can still use it, that it would act as a deterrent against leaders who were thinking of waging war and would therefore preserve many millions of lives and livelihoods.
Indeed, it is the ultimate crime. People tend to almost overlook that. It seems extraordinary that because the perpetrators wear suits and appear on television parading around like global leaders, then somehow their depiction as criminals is somewhat jarring. But of course, particularly at the moment in the case of the Israeli regime, it couldn't be more fitting. I mean, Netanyahu continues to enjoy diplomatic immunity. In fact, the United States are going so far as to persecute and sanction some of the ICC judges that are bringing the war crimes cases against Netanyahu and Gallant. I mean, the United States has completely abandoned any commitment to international law whatsoever. There isn't even the merest veneer or facade of it now.
Well, exactly. The founding fathers must be spinning in their graves, considering the fine words of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution about the rights and freedoms of man. They must look at this and wonder what the hell happened. But then again, it's what happens to every society. Societies start with a group of heroes throwing off the oppressor. But as it goes down during the generations, you get further and further away from the original philosophy and people who remember the original people who threw off the oppressor. And eventually that society becomes the oppressor until some heroes emerge elsewhere from the resistance and overthrow that society. And we are very much now in a time where we need to essentially, I don't like to use the word overthrow as such, but overthrow might be the word to use.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. We've got a slight connection problem, David. We're going to soldier on. You don't
Yeah,
appear to
yeah.
have the
Sorry.
best.
So yes, I mean, how can anybody talk about justice when they're taking out sanctions against judges who are prosecuting war crimes? And again, we shouldn't have to put up with in this country. We're fed up with being ruled by Europe or by America or by the Zionists. Can't we rule ourselves? The problem with the whole thing with the Brexit vote was that people didn't actually resign who supported Remain. Now, all the political class who supported remaining in Europe should at that point have done the honourable thing and resigned and got out of politics and allowed people who believed in this country to get on with it. But they didn't, because they have absolutely no sense of honour, and they're coining all sorts of money out of the system, not just in terms of their MP salaries and so on, but also in terms of all the things that come with that, in terms of what we might call bribes from corporations to change legislation in their favour and so
on. You make a very good point, David. I would say that the entire political class and commentariat that were calling for the Iraq war should similarly have resigned. I think no one who was in favor of that has any place in public life. They just walk away from the enormous human suffering that's created. That's the thing. We can look at casualty numbers and we can see pictures of people being blown up, but it's worth remembering that there are human beings with feelings, with nerve endings, with emotions behind all this. And yet politicians think they can effectively play some sort of grand game of Risk or Campaign or one of these board games that they play. I mean, in fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, his book is called The Grand Chessboard, isn't it? About the Cold War machinations. But just to go back to the dreaded Blair briefly, in your time in MI5, I believe you saw his file, and that he had in fact been
correct about this, Basil. I didn't actually see his file. This was 1992, and just to give the background, MI5 does vetting of everybody standing in the election, just in case they get to become MPs, and those assessments are obviously given to the Prime Minister once he's elected.
Sorry, just to interrupt, David, does that include people standing for very minor parties who stand almost no chance of being elected?
Yes, absolutely. They were all vetted if they were standing in the
so including dear old the late screaming Lord Sutch of the monster raving loony party. He would have been vetted as well in case he won.
Yes, I don't know whether Lord Sutch had a file or not, but I mean, obviously you haven't got a file. The vetting's very quick, saying we haven't got a file. But in the case of Tony Blair, at the time as well, Blair was like the shadow health secretary, something quite minor. I'm not sure it was health, but something like that. And somebody just mentioned to me in passing that they'd been reviewing his file, and they said he used to work for us in the 1980s. He was reporting on communist penetration of CND and Trotskyist penetration of the Labour Party. Now, obviously, if you're reporting on CND, you're reporting on the Labour Party, that information is getting back to government. So it's a fine line, really. Now, the reason I didn't mention this during my whistleblowing was that I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The other stuff I was blowing the whistle, I had seen my own eyes, so I could testify hand on heart, I have seen this. So I never put it forward as part of my main whistleblowing. But obviously, when I saw Blair becoming the leader of the Labour Party, I thought this is a bit weird. He's having a man who's an or they'd say a former MI5 agent at the head of the Labour Party about to become the Prime Minister. And so I didn't push it, but some left-wing activists did. They contacted Number 10, I think in the late 90s, with this information. And curiously, Number 10 didn't deny it. They were given every opportunity at this point to deny it, and all they did was, as usual, attack my character. And they could have said other stuff. They could have said, well, he hasn't heard it himself or whatever, but they didn't. They didn't deny it. Now, I've often wondered if they tried to use this to distract from other Blair stuff. We all know the story about Miranda and Tony Blair being a cross-dresser who was prosecuted for cottaging at some point. Now, again, I have no idea if that story is true or not. I know it's done the rounds. I've never managed to find any primary source for it. But nevertheless, I wondered if he tried to use the Mi5 agent thing to distract from that story. But I say, he was given a chance to deny it and didn't deny it, basically.
These days, I tend to think of Blair as being the tip of the New World Order spear. As far as I'm concerned, I think he probably, whether or not he still reports to what's now Vauxhall Bridge, David, I don't know. But certainly him and his eerily named Tony Blair Institute for Global Change seem to come out with the very worst ideas. The latest being digital ID, of course. He tried to get us to all have ID cards when Prime Minister over 20 years ago, if you remember, and we managed to bin it off then. But it's coming back with a vengeance, of course, supposedly in order to have something to do with irregular migration. Though you know what they've got to do with each other, I've absolutely no idea. Why you or I should need to prove who we are is another matter. We want to come back to that. However, I just want to touch very briefly on a little known conspiracy theory, because we are uncensored and unfiltered here on Unprecedented TV. And that is that the late John Smith, who of course was a genuine Scottish Presbyterian Christian socialist, an honest to God man who, although ostensibly coming from a different wing of the Labour Party than Jeremy Corbyn, was nevertheless couldn't be bought in much the same way, was, you know, very much his own man, very principled man, tremendous public speaker. People tend to forget that. That's how he managed to win the Labour Party leadership, was through his oratory. He was a spellbinding speaker, and he would have been Prime Minister in 1997 had he not died of a heart attack just a couple of years before the election, at which the demon Blair was massaged into the top job and then duly became Prime Minister himself. And of course, then went along with all the horrors unleashed by the Bush government in the wake of 9/11. The conspiracy theory, of course, is that John Smith was murdered. I have seen evidence that the CIA have had a heart attack gun, something that can induce a heart attack in somebody at 30 paces. Of course, there's no evidence that John Smith had a heart attack. And indeed, he had a history of some heart trouble. But having said that, his death came completely out of the blue. The whole country was shocked. And once again, it was a timeline assassination, as well as the assassination of John Smith, because Blair sort of donned John Smith's clothes, of course he did, in order to be elected leader of the Labour Party, just as Keir Starmer did with Jeremy Corbyn and all the lies he came out with in the Labour leadership election, saying that he was going to basically keep going with the hugely popular manifestos that the Corbyn era had produced. But once in office, it soon became clear. Well, Claire Short actually said very interestingly that something changed around 99, 2000. And the initial sort of semi-enlightened progressivism of the Blair government gave way to neoliberalism and warmongering. David.
Yeah, can I pick up on these points, Basil? First, the heart attack inducing gun is in fact what's known as the ice bullet. And what they do is they'll fire 2 ice bullets into your heart, get a sniper to do it. And of course, these 2 ice bullets then melt from your body's warmth. So it induces a heart attack without leaving a trace. Now, I think I was subject to that when I'd been invited back to Amsterdam by a backer who cut me off and then suddenly said to me out of the blue, "Oh, come back, I want to back you again," which I found highly suspicious. I'm walking along one of the canals in Amsterdam, which if you know your military stuff, provides the ideal situation for a sniper, those tall, thin buildings and so on. And I swear to you, I was walking along down by the canal and I literally felt something whistle past me and then 2 pings on the stone cobbles, basically. Dogs started barking and pigeons flew off. And I thought, oh my God, you know, what the hell happened there? And I'm a man of faith. I asked God and God said, yeah, they just shot two ice bullets at you. So these things do exist and they tried to use it on me. That's been part of the series.
Sounds like the Day of the Jackal, David, you know, with the,
yes,
with the shot ricocheting off the pavement. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I say if God's on your side, God keeps you alive, basically. That's very much my view. That was part of the series of attempts on my life, beginning with when I was being taken by Mohammed Al-Fayed's chauffeur in a Mercedes up to Paris to discuss the death of Diana. And the driver fell asleep at the wheel. Unfortunately, when we hit the Central Reservation, he woke up again and got the car under control. And I can tell you there'll be many, many things like this, also involving food poisonings and the introduction of meningitis C. And it's only because I tend to know how to deal with these things. In the case of the food poisoning and the meningitis C, I use decarboxylated cannabis tea to essentially cure myself. In both cases, that worked very quickly. But in terms of this pattern with John Smith, if it was only John Smith who died of a heart attack, perhaps we could all say, yeah, conspiracy theory. But if we go back to 1963, the leader of the Labour Party was a man called Hugh Gateskill. He was, and obviously at this time there'd been a bit like in the 1990s, there was suddenly massive disillusionment with the long-term ruling Conservative Party. In this case, it was to do with the Profumo affair. So it was pretty much a shoe-in for the next Labour leader to be Prime Minister. Now, Hugh Gateskill was somebody from the establishment, so he had all sorts of networks and things like that. He knew how the system worked. Now, he died of a heart attack. And then we also go beyond the 2000. We go to Robin Cook. Robin Cook resigned from the Labour government over the Iraq war and was touting himself around as an alternative to lead the Labour Party and therefore become the next Prime Minister of Britain. He died of a heart attack. He was out on a hiking trip and he had a heart attack. And from nowhere, and this is only mentioned in the first reports, an RAF helicopter saw him, picked him up. His girlfriend or wife said that he was alive when he got in the helicopter. He was dead and arrived in hospital. So we have 3 Labour Prime Ministers in waiting who are going to be left wing and put forward a proper Labour agenda, and all 3 of them die of heart attacks. Now, when you get 3 things like that happening, it doesn't look like a coincidence. You look like you're seeing a pattern here, a clear pattern operating. So I'm inclined to believe that Gateskill, Smith, and Cook were all assassinated by the Zionist New World Order because they knew that they would not be manipulable in the way that people like Blair were. Now, just to finish this off, of course, they brought in Harold Wilson instead of Gateskill. The elite thought that because Wilson came from a lower middle class background, he would not have the same power base as Gateskill. But Harold Wilson was an absolutely brilliant politician. We don't give him enough credit. He was our John F. Kennedy, although he obviously didn't have the same obvious charisma. But he was a man who instinctively understood how to interact with the people and understood the power of television in the new media age and so on. But he turned out to be even more difficult for them to handle because he had a brilliant mind. He got one of the best degrees from Oxford of the 20th century. He was a brilliant economist. And he refused to send troops to Vietnam. And it's for that reason that we now see his name besmirched by the New World Order, saying that he was a KGB agent. And I believe the same thing about Ted Heath. I don't believe Ted Heath was a paedophile. I actually believe that has been put out by the New World Order because, again, Heath refused to send troops to Vietnam as well.
That's an interesting take. Of course, Wilson was sort of more left-wing than people assumed, and there was the Mountbatten plot to, depose him in some sort of coup in the mid-1970s, wasn't there? And he resigned ostensibly because he had Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's or something, and Jim Callahan took over. But the plot against Wilson was outlined in A Very British Coup by Chris Mullen.
Yeah, well, this is what happened. The story is that various members of the Prime Minister woke up one morning to find army manoeuvres going on in Whitehall that he hadn't been told about. Now, this is just absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that we're not allowed to know about this stuff, but there was, the research into this, and this wasn't just some pie in the sky thing. There was networks set up. There was a man called David Sterling who was coordinating this. It wasn't just pie in the sky stuff, and they appeared to have the ear of the senior army officers. And their argument, of course, was that Britain was being taken over by Trotskyists and so on, and which is just simply not true. But it showed the mentality of the army in those days. And again, we should now be having that information released to us so we can make decisions about the sort of country we want to live in and learn lessons from that. But I say, there really were people with well advanced plans for a right-wing coup in this country in the 1970s.
Fast forward 40 years, and the British Army were using pictures of Jeremy Corbyn for target practice. Although he survived physical assassination, he was politically assassinated for all that he sought merely to restore social democracy to Britain, the social contract, public ownership of utilities, and some modicum of redistribution of wealth back to where it was 30 or 40 years ago. We now have wealth concentrated in the hands of a tiny few, more so than in Georgian or Victorian times. But of course, the big reason why Jeremy Corbyn was politically assassinated, not allowed to become prime minister, was his support for Palestinian human rights, David.
Absolutely. Well, obviously, Corbyn was a wholly declared anti-Zionist, like I have been as well.
No, I disagree. No, not at all, David. No, I've got to pull you up there. And this is a particularly interesting point with respect to the new party, your party, whatever it's going to be called. At the moment, and definitions have varied, of course, but a Zionist is somebody who believes in Israel's right to exist. That as an ethno-state practicing apartheid, Israel has the right to carry on. I mean, you can go on with the, apartheid denying, genocide denying, if you want, forever, whatever you like. So any supporter of the so-called two-state solution is a Zionist because they believe in Israel's right to exist. As far as I know, Corbyn has always voiced support for the two-state solution, an independent Palestinian state, sovereign living alongside Israel. That makes him a Zionist. The problem that the ultra-Zionists had was that he wasn't Zionist enough, that he wanted to genuinely see a Palestinian state. And Hussein Shafei Hoz, who was close to Corbyn and Corbynites, said that he was approached by the Israeli embassy and asked if he would give Israel to green light to do whatever they want at any stage in his premiership. And he said, no, of course not. And so that's why he was attacked as voraciously as he was. But he's still a Zionist. So, an anti-Zionist now means somebody who wants to see the state of Israel as presently constituted dismantled and replaced by a single state covering the whole of Palestine with one person, one vote, equal rights for all, etc.
Yeah, that definition of Zionism is a very Zionist definition of Zionism. The Zionism I'm speaking about is actually the Zionism that seeks to subjugate man and is set out in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, before we start shrinking about this as an anti-Semitic document, we only have to read the document to see what they predict in 1897 has come to pass. So that in itself is the proof, and they discuss.
But it's a forgery, David. It's well known to be a forgery.
Yeah, if I forge the Mona Lisa, I finish up with an exact copy. So what I'm saying is that they're not the official minutes of the International Zionist Congress, but they are an accurate representation of what was discussed in secret rooms at the Zionist Congress, basically. And that when I refer to Zionism, I'm talking about the tactics they use in terms of control through things like the pharmaceutical industry, the oil industry, the war industry, and so on. But I suggest anybody who has an inquiring mind goes and reads the protocols for themselves and decides whether that agenda has been followed for about the last 130 years, because it appears very, very clear to me. So I use Zionism in a slightly different way. I used to believe in a two-state solution, but I've now come to the conclusion that that we need a one-state solution, and that's Palestine. That there has never been any legitimacy about Jews going to that area And essentially, in the first place, in 1947, displacing 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. And this is recognized by a UN Security Council resolution stating that those people have the right of return to where they lived, and also have the right to compensation under the inalienable rights of the law. So I don't actually believe in that two-state solution anymore. As far as I'm concerned, those Zionists have no rights whatsoever. Anybody who has supported this genocide in any way needs to be rounded up and put in a prison colony for life or executed, as far as I'm concerned. We need to lance this cancer of Zionism because it's sick. I mean, you know, what sort of human being allows kids to be starved to death? You know, that's not normal. I'm sorry. And, you know, this is a problem I've had. I've been sending this document out to certain people and they don't want to respond to it. And I have to say to them, you know, I'm sorry, but that is what separates us from the animals. The ability to empathize and think, what is it like for those parents in Palestine struggling for their children and seeing the IDF blocking aid coming in and blocking medical supplies that could keep their children alive. Now, any parent should be able to empathize with that and think, God, if somebody did that to my children, I'd be mad as hell. I'd be doing everything I could to try and stop it. So it's been a failure of empathy, which is, say, one of the real things that separates us from the animals, on the part of many, many people. And I do not want to see people who do not share our values. People who support genocide are not supporting British values. And if they have a loyalty to the foreign power of Israel, we need to get rid of them because they all, as Jews, have an automatic right to Israeli nationality. So we should be sending all these people off to that benighted piece of land. It should not be recognized as a state. It should have no rights. And those people should be working to compensate the Palestinians and to compensate other people for the crimes they've carried out. Now, we haven't started talking yet about Israeli responsibility for 9/11, which, when you do the research, is absolutely clear that you've only got to look.
Before we get into that, David, some particularly high weeds, here's another meme that I found this morning. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, it is Judaism. And you can see two Orthodox Jewish people there in New York. There are very large numbers of anti-Zionist Jews, whether from Orthodox sects like that, or from more traditional or liberal Zionist congregations, particularly amongst young people in the United States, who are simply horrified by the slaughter going on in Palestine. So Zionists really, it's by no means an exclusively Jewish preserve. In fact, the anti-Zionist Jewish scholar Tony Greenstein, who was kicked out of the Labour Party for anti-Semitism, makes sense of that, if you will. Gentiles kicking Jews out of the Labour Party for anti-Semitism. Well, only, of course, because they're the wrong kind of Jew, because they are anti-Zionist. So Zionist these days basically means you support this hyper-violent, aggressively land-grabbing apartheid state, whether you are a Gentile or Jewish. And indeed, there are far more Gentile Zionists than there are Jewish ones. The Prime Minister of Great Britain and the leader of the opposition amongst the biggest supporters of Zionism, David.
Yes, well, if you actually talk to those Orthodox Jews, you will realize that they don't support the state of Israel. They will tell you that this is not part of biblical prophecy. So that they don't support the state of Israel like me. They don't think it should exist. They think there should be a Palestinian state. But yes, there is a problem with Christians who call themselves Zionists. Again, the two commandments given in the Bible that people don't know, I think there's 10, love God and love your neighbors, you love yourself. Those appear in 3 of the 4 Gospels, but they also appear in the Torah, the first 4 books of what we call the Old Testament and what the Jews call the Torah. So when people have a go at me about being an anti-Semite, I throw them off the scent by saying to them, I'm a covenant Jew. Of course, they don't know what I'm talking about, but they've suddenly got to think twice because I've suddenly identified as Jewish. Of course, I'm not Jewish, you know. But if you are truly Jewish and you are truly Christian, in fact, you're a true human being. You live under those two commandments, love God and love your neighbours, you love yourself. Now, even if you struggle with God and say you're a professed atheist, you still look after your fellow man. You show compassion to your fellow man. And by showing that compassion to your fellow man, you get to see God. Those who claim to see God and put God's word forward are always the worst kind of people, persecuting homosexuals, persecuting these people, condemning people who have sex outside marriage. That is nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus Christ and nothing to do with the true law.
You make a very good point. Now, to swing back to Palestine quickly and the reportage of it, which has been so abysmal. Here's Media Lens posting this morning. BBC's headline originally read, Israeli military says first stages of assault on Gaza City have begun. Well, I don't know what they've been doing for the last 2 years if they haven't been assaulting Gaza City from the air, thousands of bodies under the rubble. But what the headline really should have said, as Media Lens have said, is the latest stage of Israel's genocide and ethnic cleansing is underway, because that's what it is. And one of the biggest problems we've had over the last 2 years, indeed it's a big problem, period, David, is the way that you and I are old enough to remember the last century, is the way that particularly this century, the standard of journalism has deteriorated to the point where certainly the BBC, the Telegraph, absolutely basket case, ITV slightly better in some respects, but they're basically stenographers for government, and for power we see very little genuine investigative journalism anywhere, do we, David?
This has been the problem, yes. I mean, there is investigative journalism going on, but none of it's happening in any form of corporate or mainstream media. Now, obviously, the biggest disappointment in this is the BBC, considering, I say we fund it. I don't pay the TV license and haven't paid the TV license for 30 years, but and nor would I. But that is a real problem because people are funding this form of propaganda. And the BBC has been particularly keen to undermine the alternative, well, say the truth views about 9/11 as well, using its form of particularly unscientific journalism. So, yes, the state of the media now is abhorrent, but this comes through corporate control. And again, we can blame Blair here. These are very strict rules on media ownership, but they were all relaxed by Tony Blair, meaning that big corporations can own an arms industry and also own a media outlet. Now, obviously, that parent corporation is going to ensure that they use their media to promote their arms branch rather than opposing war. But that's how simple it is. And that, again, is another example of Tony Blair being a fascist. And let's be clear, fascism, as defined by Mussolini, was the union of state and corporate power that he envisaged as a left-wing ideology. So I'm sorry, what we see at the moment from people who self-identify as so-called liberals, they are in fact fascists. They believe in this kind of corporate government union at the expense of the true rights of man. But yeah, it really is. But let's be clear about this as well. This is to do with changing graphics. That when I was a journalist, there were very few graduates involved in journalism. I think it was around 20%, and that over the decades went up. So what it was again was these middle-class morons who have no natural intelligence, no natural ability, but are pushed because they come from the right background, they have the right contacts, they go to the right public schools, the right Oxbridge colleges. Now, people say I've had a chip on my shoulder about this for the last 20, 30 years, but, I was pointing out that the incompetence of those people is what has led us into these wars, has led to the transfer of wealth in the way we've seen it, has led to we're now paying $4 billion a week in interest payments on the national debt directly to the Bank of England. We're in fact ruled under a secret deed of indemnity between the government and the Bank of England. Now, to put that 4 billion figure, because these figures, obviously, when they're large, people can't get their heads around them. Recently, the government tried to cut 6 billion from the annual budget by taking benefits off disabled people, essentially, to put it as simply as you can. And yet they could have just cancelled the national repayment of the national debt for a week and a half, and that would have been more than taken care of. But to put this in perspective another way, at the rate of 4 billion a week, in the next 8 months, the British taxpayer will be giving the Bank of England more money than the combined wealth of Britain's 5 richest billionaires earned in their entire lifetimes. So that gives you an idea of how we're giving away money hand over fist. And this has to stop right now, not next week, next month. It's going to stop right now. We cannot be giving 4 billion to the Zionist scum to pursue their enslavement and subjugation of mankind and to wage war crimes. And let's face it, Israel has admitted dropping white phosphorus on civilians in Gaza. It did so in the noughties. There's also abundant evidence that after the 7th of October, they also used white phosphorus in that assault on the Palestinian people. Now, again, let's be absolutely clear about this. White phosphorus is a chemical that burns through the skin to the bone. Could you imagine seeing your loved one suffering that kind of excruciating pain? Now, again, I say to every Zionist out there, if it was your children, you'd be doing something about this, yeah? That is not, there's no excuse for using a chemical weapon like that. If you're defending yourselves, you defend yourselves. You do not go around dropping dangerous chemicals on children so they suffer in that way. But as I say, that gives you an idea where we are. We have to link the two together, that Israel, the Zionist state, is also set up by the Zionist bankers. We know that the Rothschilds lobbying in the background were behind the Balfour Declaration that subsequently led to the State of Israel. One of the reasons this country's in a state is we were one of the first countries to be taken over by the Zionists, who were the Rothschilds. You've only got to go on the Rothschilds' own website to see how they'll tell you that they took over the English economy after the Battle of Waterloo by using a form of false information, pretending that the Duke of Wellington had lost. Investors then started rapidly selling their shares to what are called shell companies, so you can't find out who the parent company is. And then suddenly, man walks in from the Rothschilds, says, no, we won the Battle of Waterloo. And by this time, the Rothschilds have very cheaply bought up the British economy. That's why we're in the state we're in. Zionist bankers do not invest into true trade and industry. They make money out of money. That's why our roads are in a state. You know, anybody who's trading wants good communications, wants good roads to be able to transport their goods, to be able to get around the country. This is also, again, why they're attacking the motor car. The motor car has to be the greatest invention there's ever been for personal liberty. Now, obviously, I've got massive problems with putting petrochemicals in it. But as Henry Ford showed us in the 1930s, he produced a Model T that ran off hemp oil and was made of a fiberglass made from hemp and sisal. So these things are entirely possible. We should not have been reliant on oil. And our reliance on oil is what created the problems in the Middle East, basically. In fact, the first round of inflation in my lifetime was in the 1970s. And that was caused by the OPEC countries essentially withholding their oil because of Israel's actions in the Middle East. Firstly, the 1967 occupations, and then the 1973, I think they call it the 6-Day War, where essentially Israel went and bombed the Egyptian Air Force for no reason. They said that it was a preemptive attack, but there was no evidence of that whatsoever. So we have to connect dots.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, talking of connecting dots, you emailed me a number of slides to look at, so I'm going to run through them now from the top, and as they appear on the screen, you explain them to our viewers and listeners, and when you'd like to see the next one, just say next slide please, Basil. David.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
There we go. Now this, I believe, is a text you sent to Trump at the beginning of this month. Yeah,
and this basically, we should be doing this the other way around with the call for Palestine. This was the last thing I wanted to talk about, but let's talk about it now. Is that this has been sent to Trump? He's got I've sent it to him at the White House address. I've sent it to him on Facebook, and people can read this statement for themselves. It's on my Facebook account, but therefore it clearly shows Israeli involvement in 9/11. This involvement does not come from some wild-eyed conspiracy theorist. The evidence of Israeli involvement in 9/11 comes from the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Agency. In terms of the FBI, we've all heard of the 5 dancing Israelis, or anybody involved interested in this stuff has. People don't realize how much evidence there was against them, that the When they were arrested, the FBI, the bomb sniffing dogs detected explosive traces on a blanket. This is in FBI records. They had targeting maps. They had travel documents making a quick getaway. They had false documentation. On arrest, they lied to police where they were at the time of the 9/11 attacks. So in that nutshell yourself, you've got enough evidence that if those people were before 12 good people and true on a jury, you'll be able to convict without reasonable doubt. And now they weren't the only ones, though. This is what people don't realize, is that day there were dozens of Israeli arrested in New York, which is in the same FBI documents. I've got the source material about the dancing Israelis. And they all work for a company called Urban Moving Systems. And in the subsequent days, the FBI investigated this company. They found that there was nothing in the company premises to indicate they were involved in moving people's from house to house or from flat to flat. Obviously conclude this was a front organization for Israeli intelligence. The man who headed the company, a man called Dominic Suter, was placed on a wanted list for 9/11 by the FBI shortly after the attacks. He unfortunately had already fled and gone back to Israel. The only reason the dancing Israelis and the other Israelis, and let's be clear, the dancing Israelis, 2 of them are reported to be Mossad officers. So this is some kind of official Israeli operation. The only reason they were sent back to Israel was because pressure was put on the American government by the Israel lobby. It wasn't to do with a decision made by an attorney general about prosecution or a grand jury or anything else. In fact, this is the most enormous perversion of justice there's probably been in American history. But it's not just those dancing Israelis. Again, what people don't know, they may have heard of something called the Shayler Memorandum, which was prepared by a US attorney based in New York shortly after the 9/11 Commission reported. I'm not sure whether he's being disingenuous or not, but he puts all the evidence together and says, oh yeah, Israel was trying to get intelligence prior to the 9/11 attacks, but didn't give the US government enough intelligence to stop them, knowing that then the US would be bound to take action in the Middle East. I'm not sure whether he's being disingenuous or not, but he doesn't consider the evidence against the 5 dancing Israelis. He mentions them, but he doesn't consider the fact that they have blankets with traces of explosives on them, for example. But if you read his research, which he says based on the Drug Enforcement Agency, they got suspicious prior to 9/11, in the years and months running up to 9/11, about a group of Israelis operating under cover of being art students who were trying to pitch people in the Drug Enforcement Agency, but also in the Department of Defense and the State Department and so on. And they subsequently find all the details of these people, and they are expelled shortly before 9/11. But all these Israelis have intelligence backgrounds in military intelligence, in technical skills, particularly communications, telecommunications, and so on. And what you realize, of course, once you've realized that Muslims were not involved, these people are not following around Muslims. They're creating the patsies. They're using false documentation to indicate that perhaps there are Muslims in America looking to attack America. But the correlations that Shayler comes up in his memorandum shows a clear correlation between the locations of where these supposed Muslim hijackers are and the locations of these Israeli intelligence officers. A very, very clear correlation between the two. So we have to conclude, in the absence of any evidence implicating Muslims, that these were people creating patsies for the attacks. And again, so this is official government information. It's not conspiracy theory. Hello?
Yeah, well, the dancing Israelis went on television when they returned to Israel and actually said they were there to document the event. Well, obviously they couldn't have been documenting the event unless they'd known about it in advance. They had cameras and were watching from across the other side of the Hudson River, and there are news reports about that circulating at the time. There was also a second van of Israelis was apprehended on Washington Bridge, David. I don't know if you know about that.
Yeah, I was saying
that was deemed to contain explosives as well.
Yeah, I was saying they're not the 5 dancing Israelis are not the only Israelis to be arrested that day. They all appear to be linked to this company called Urban Moving Systems that later is closed down by the American authorities. So it's obviously a front for Mossad. So it's not just the dancing Israelis, it goes much further than that. And again, these people are in Mossad, which is the Israeli state intelligence service. The fact the Israeli government is lobbying to get these people back out of America shows to me that this is an official operation. It's not Mossad just conducting an operation without the knowledge of the Israeli government. And indeed, when Benjamin Netanyahu is approached by a journalist to comment on 9/11 on the day, his first response is, "It is very good for us." He suddenly backtracks and goes, I mean, it's good for us in terms of stopping, Islam and so on, our enemies. But his very first reaction is, it is very good for us. That's what he says about 9/11. And you're absolutely right with the dancing Israelis. Why were they cheering? When you see a thing like that, your first reaction, of course, is to be concerned for people in the Twin Towers who are in the offices of people, because it wasn't even clear they were planes to start with. So why would you be cheering when people have just been killed in the Twin Towers, unless you were the people carrying out operation, you're cheering the success of it.
And of course, there were numerous Zionists absent from the Twin Towers, including, of course, Larry Silverstein himself, who was there every day and then mysteriously had an appointment at his dermatologist on the morning of 9/11. So he was in another part of New York. How convenient. And the Jewish comedian Al Franken, who later became a senator for Minnesota, in his autobiography, he said that he was called by the former mayor of New York, Ed Koch, and told not to go to the Twin Towers or indeed to downtown, to that part of Lower Manhattan on 9/11. So former mayor of New York knew it was going to happen in advance.
Yeah, well, this is it. I haven't gone into the detail on that. I'm aware of those stories. There are other stories about a messaging service used to.
That's right, the Odigo messaging service. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of people who would normally from Goldman Sachs have been in the building that day weren't there. And obviously, Goldman Sachs employs a lot of Jews. We have all the evidence that Israel knew about this before, and in the same way as we do about 7/7. Benjamin Netanyahu was in London on the day of 7/7 and was given a warning by Mossad prior to those attacks happening. Again, this shows prior knowledge. Scotland Yard denied they gave the warning. But also that day, only a few hours after the attack, so again, when no one knows what's going on, a former head of Mossad wrote an article for the Jerusalem Post in which he talks about an operation in which there were simultaneous explosions. And at the time, people didn't know the explosions were simultaneous. They were reporting they were at least half an hour apart. So again, this shows prior knowledge of the detail of the attacks. So again, we have clear evidence that, and again, prior knowledge, just to be clear with people who don't understand these things. I sometimes just mention these things in passing because I'm an ex-intelligence officer. But if somebody has prior knowledge of a crime, that's usually a pretty good indication they're involved in it. Yeah. So we've got to again ask why these people haven't been arrested for 7/7, and we can talk about the same kind of fake evidence in 7/7 as there is in 9/11. The very first picture released of the so-called three of them outside Luton Station is a very, very obvious forgery. That's actually the one taken on the practice run, which people can see is a very clear picture. If you then show the one, no, that's not it. It's the one before. That one. You know how unclear that one is compared to the one on the practice run. It doesn't look like it's taken from the same camera even. And as I've highlighted on this picture, you can see the railing goes in front of the guy's arm. This is an obvious fake. People might like to note as well, the figure in the background is wearing a white T-shirt with blue on it. And on the practice run, he was wearing a blue shirt with white on it. It looks like they've just simply taken the images from the practice run on the 28th of June and superimposed them upon these images. Now, you have to bear in mind that the other factor in this is that Israel, an Israeli company, was responsible for CCTV security on the London Underground. Now, we've got to ask, how the hell does that happen in the first place? Why do we have a foreign country or a company from a foreign country operating security on London Underground. That is, in fact, a real vital part of our national security. Because if you take out the London Underground, anybody tell you it is chaos in London. It costs the economy billions and so on. And yet we have a foreign country responsible for security. But that, of course, means that we don't have to prove the intention. They've got the capability. If you're responsible for the CCTV, you can get into the London Underground. But also, of course, you can fake the pictures from CCTV cameras and so on. So
I'd like to get into the high weeds of 7/7, of course, because we had the 20th anniversary earlier this year. A lot of scurrilous figures on the right used it to further stir up anti-Muslim hatred in the UK, when, of course, they had nothing to do with it. Because, 20 years hence, but one really only needs to sort of pause and reflect on the official story that we're being told to see what obvious nonsense it is. At the time, there was all this scaremongering about jihadi cells in the UK, but there was no evidence at all that these four young lads from Leeds had been radicalized in any way. In fact, the so-called ringleader, Mohammed Siddiq Khan, he was somebody that the police went to when there were community issues to help smooth the waters. They had neither the capability nor the organizational structure, nor indeed the motivation and the ideology to launch a series of deadly attacks on the underground using what was described by the French intelligence officer who visited the scene as very obviously military-grade explosives. I mean, they were very young lads, these boys. They simply were not. They were classic patsies. They had the right sort of surnames, but that was about it. And then, of course, they were made to film those ludicrous confession videos. A couple of other points. The official version of events, because it was unable to be proven that the so-called suicide bombers had access to any meaningful type of devastating explosive. The official version of events is that the bombs used were made out of black pepper. Yes, you heard me right. That is actually the latest official version of events. And that one of these bombs made out of black pepper, in fact, the one used by Mohammed Siddiq Khan, which was a relatively small rucksack, something that appeared to contain nothing much more than a flask of tea and a few sandwiches, that managed to blow 3 separate holes in the floor of a London Underground train, holes that clearly show a blast coming up from underneath. So one small rucksack containing a bomb made of black pepper blows 3 holes in the floor of an underground train, in some cases causing maximum injury to people's lower limbs. People had their feet blown off, that kind of thing. And then finally, the last point, David, then it's over to you to wrap up. There were also reports, it was widely reported on the day, though very quickly buried, that 3 so-called suicide bombers at around lunchtime on that day had been shot dead by armed police at Canary Wharf. The speculation is that these were indeed the so-called suicide bombers who had left central London, were suddenly aware of the fact that they'd been set up as patsies and were making their way to Canary Wharf in order to tell their stories to the media.
Yeah, many people know that story, but people aren't acquainted with what is even more interesting is people will remember that there was a man called Jean-Charles de Menezes who was shot at Stockwell on the 22nd of July. And this was the day after we'd had 4 supposed attacks upon the transport network again by Muslim suicide bombers. But the theory was that this was some way of flushing out the remaining 7/7 bomber, Hasib Hussein. Now, when you look at the John, and I know a copper who did all the research into this, and he said he didn't know, he wasn't coming from the same angle as me. He was just saying that I know that everybody here is lying. And I don't know why. I spoke to someone who used to work as a guard in the London Underground. And one of their arguments, of course, was the CCTV wasn't working at the time that de Menezes was shot by police. And he said to me that because Stockwell is a deep station, that if the CCTV is not working, the station should have been shut down. So clearly that argument, the CCTV wasn't working, is a false argument. The people who witnessed what happened saw the man leap over the barrier who was being pursued by police. In fact, we know that de Menezes put his Oyster card in because he had a registered Oyster card. So he's clearly not the same man the police are pursuing. Although he does bear a certain facial resemblance to Hasib Hussein. There's also a witness report on the tube before the man is shot. And this man is under control. He's not in a position to, you can quite clearly see he doesn't have a suicide vest on. And one of the witnesses says it was almost like he recognized the copper who was challenging him, which again raises all sorts of weird issues. Or it could just be that this is the moment he was waiting for to be arrested. But I very strongly believe that the man who died in 22/7 and was killed at the hands of the police was in fact Hasib Hussein, who had to be killed because you couldn't be obviously a suicide bomber who's supposed to have been killed on 7/7 and be alive after that. But let's also be clear about the.
So what happened to Menezes? We're going to have to leave
we
it.
Never know what these people. We don't know. It's like what happened to the people who are supposed to be on flight 93 or flight
Absolutely, I know.
American Airlines 11. I don't know. I've no idea. What I can tell you is those planes are not getting to those buildings. That's what I can tell you for a fact.
Well, we'll come back next week and we'll talk about that. But the other thing, of course, is Menezes was an electrician working on the underground trains. And the theory is that he was aware of the fact that they'd been wired for explosives and they were worried about him talking. So that's another possibility. David Shayler, thank you so much for joining me today on The Leading Edge with Basil Valentine. Fascinating conversation. And we'll have another one very soon. Do please come back and join me. I'll be back on Tuesday. It's a bank holiday on Monday, and I look forward to seeing you all then. This is Unprecedented TV.
Thank you.
Unfiltered, uncensored, unprecedented TV.